Hey, well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tim Gibson, for those of you who have not had the opportunity to meet yet this evening, and I'm privileged to serve as the president of the King's College, New York City. So tonight is an evening we've been looking forward to for quite a while. There's any number of reasons that people are aware of King's or are drawn to King's, whether it's our majors that are each aligned to these strategic institutions that shape and influence society, whether that's government, law, business, the arts, or of course, journalism. But beyond just those academic majors, we also are home to a number of centers, including the center that is hosting our event this evening, the McCandlish Phillips Journalism Institute. So that institute is led by its director, Professor Paul Glatter, who I will not even attempt, that's right, yeah, the whistles, that's good. Applause for, yeah, it's good stuff. Look, Professor Glatter has been with King's since 2013 and has done a remarkable job of envisioning, implementing, fundraising, networking. He is quite the exemplar of how to, in a very entrepreneurial way, work within an academic context, but still remain remarkably engaged in his craft. And so I will not even attempt to go through his many accolades or even the number of hats that Professor Glatter wears, but rather just turn it over to him this evening and allow him to introduce our guest speaker. Paul.
Thank you, President Gibson, and I just want to thank our whole team at MPJI, including Lauren for ordering the food, Deb with the tech help, and Eleni and Clemente, Alicia, everybody who's helped. So thanks so much. We're so glad to do something in person. It's been too long, right? Let's give a round of applause. I'm so glad to see so many of you here from all over the campus. So I want to give first a word about our journalism programs at the King's College. I just want to say that the students who attend our four-year major in journalism, culture, and society, as well as students in the room here from 42 different colleges who attend our NYC semester in journalism program that we have here at King's, they all at some point hear about a man named John McCandlish Phillips, who we see a visage outline of here. And he's the namesake of our Journalism Institute here at King's, and also of this lecture series. And I just want to tell you, in one sense, who he was. He was an outstanding reporter at the New York Times for more than 2 decades. He was an exemplar of being a great reporter, being a mentor, and as a person of faith. And so we celebrate his legacy. He was a friend to me and many people here in New York. And we celebrate his legacy with student scholarships and a few other things, including this annual lecture on our campus. And I think it's fitting, given some of the things we're going to hear about tonight, that we have Walter Hussman as our speaker this evening for this 8th lecture of the McCandlish Phillips series. Let me tell you just a little bit about Walter Hussman, who I only wish, for those of you who've lived decades, can understand what he's done in our industry. So let me just tell you a few high points. He's a newspaper publisher and business leader based in Little Rock, Arkansas, where, as you know, if you got our emails, he's unfortunately stuck because of storms, but he's also intrepid to join us through technology to be with us tonight. He's a 3rd-generation newspaper publisher who's guided the successful ethical, editorial, and entrepreneurial strategy at his company. He serves as publisher of the flagship paper, the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette in Arkansas, and is president and CEO of WEHCO Media, which owns dozens of newspapers, magazines, broadcast stations, and other media-related entities, not just in Arkansas, but in several states throughout the U.S., especially in southern states. He's got a bachelor's degree from UNC Chapel Hill and an MBA from Columbia University right here in New York, which I'm excited about. And as a young man, he spent time working in the family newspaper biz as early as age 10, I read. And then after business school, he worked as a reporter for Forbes magazine here in New York before he moved back to Arkansas and joined his family's business. So I hope a lot of the students are thinking of questions you might want to ask Walter after his talk. And I wanted you to know he spent time as a reporter as well as in business, and spent time in New York as well as in Arkansas and other places. So he's proved to be a savvy businessman who's fended off larger conglomerate chains to forge a strong regional media company. He's won awards for creating iPad editions of his company's newspapers, offering iPads free to all his readers. I hope some of the entrepreneurial journalism students are listening to some of these kinds of things and are thinking of questions. So the title of his lecture tonight, though, is called, is this, Restoring Public Trust in News. We want to hear more about this, and please welcome with me Walter Hussman.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate the introduction, and I'm honored to be the speaker tonight for the John McCandlish Phillips Lecture. I think this is the 8th annual, and I again apologize for not being there. April is tornado season in Arkansas, and we've had some very severe and unusual weather down here the last several days. So anyway, but I'm glad to be able to address you here with the new technology of Zoom. So tonight I want to talk about a serious problem we have in America with journalism. It relates to a serious lack of trust in news reporting. I believe journalism has two parts. One part is news reporting, and the other part is delivering opinions. The serious lack of trust has to do with what the public perceives as a lack of fairness in news reporting. They believe that injecting opinion has become too much a part of news reporting. Almost any journalism school would teach you that you need a clear and distinct separation between news opinion and opinion writing. But more and more news organizations have blurred those lines, and often they're not clearly labeling what is news and what is opinion. But you don't need to take my word for it. I want to show you what the public thinks. Now, the Gallup Poll has been recording what Americans say about trust in the news media now for 40 years. And you'll see here on the screen the cover of a poll that was released in February 2020, 2 years ago. This was an unusual poll. It covered 20,000 interviews, and they interviewed people in all 50 states. So this was funded in part also by the Knight Foundation. And as you can see on this next slide, some 40 years ago, over half of Americans trusted the news media. And as you can see, that's dropped each decade. And so that by 2019, it was at the very lowest point of 23%. Really discouraging there. And in this next slide, you can see how it compares to other American institutions. For example, the military has the greatest confidence of the American people at 74%. And if you look at all these institutions, the newspapers and television are down there near the bottom. Television's only above Congress, which is not saying a lot. So anyway, it's, you can see how confidence has really eroded. Now, if you delve into this report, you will see what Americans said about the lack of trust in news, which was even more disturbing. For example, a majority of Americans, 49%, said they had, a great deal, saw a great deal of bias in news reporting. And another 37% saw a fair amount of bias in news reporting. If you add up those two numbers, you're 86% of Americans who see bias in news reporting. Well, that's a problem. And if we ask Americans, do they think this is a problem? 73% of them said it's a major problem. So that's also quite a picture. Looking at the next slide, you'll see that they say in this survey that they think this inaccurate, the bias is actually intentional. And 54% believe that reporters are actually misrepresenting the facts. And next fact is stunning. 28% of Americans thought reporters were just making it up. is also from the Gallup report. I'll show you another level of this, how the trust was differentiated regarding different media. So you'll see the greatest trust is in local media, local newspapers, local television stations, local radio. And if you look at, you'll see that trust in national news organizations, including newspapers, national newspapers, is significantly lower. Unfortunately, it's the local media that's struggling today with sustainability, while the national newspapers are doing a far better job in the digital world because they have a much larger potential audience to reach. But if we lose more and more local news outlets, and we've already lost over 2,000 in the last 15 years, mostly weekly newspapers, if we lose more, we're going to lose more trust in news reporting in America. And now I want to call your attention to a survey that was done last year by the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford, England. This survey was even larger. They surveyed 92,000 people in 46 countries on all 6 continents. Well, actually, there's a 7th continent, but no one to interview, I guess, on Antarctica. They asked a lot of questions other than trust. But one of the questions they asked was, do you trust the news media in your country? Now, the country that ranked the highest was Finland. 65% of the people in Finland trust the news media there. The country that was ranked the lowest was the United States. Here's a story that was reported on that. So if we don't believe in journalism that we've got a serious problem in America, we're just not being realistic. So how did all this happen? How did we lose so much confidence among the American public? Well, for many, many years, survey after survey showed that the public generally thought most of the media was leaning more left than right and was more liberal than conservative. And then along came Fox News, and they realized they could create a niche by having a more conservative approach to news. Indeed, they soon realized they could get very good ratings with opinion shows, and those opinion shows were far less expensive to produce than having bureaus around the world. For a while, Fox News employed far fewer people than their competitor, CNN, but you couldn't tell it from the ratings. Fox News also proved they could have a smaller audience compared to the broadcast network news shows, yet they could still be profitable. Well, this did not go unnoticed. Soon MSNBC was trying to carve out its own niche on the left. CNN, probably for economic reasons, realized it was far less expensive to have opinion shows like Fox, and they moved away from a straightforward news format. Walter Isaacson, who ran CNN News in its earlier version, has confirmed that in recent years it bears little resemblance to the objective format that drove its initial popularity in the 1980s. Well, because of the 24-hour news cycle and the fact that there are slow news days, the cable news networks adopted a new policy where they would report anything that anybody else reported, even before verifying the accuracy. Most newspapers had a standard where they would try to verify for accuracy before publishing. And in this regard, the Associated Press was a great resource. For example, if a newspaper in Hartford, Connecticut reported on a news event there, we wouldn't necessarily report it in Little Rock until the AP moved the story. This gave us and other newspapers the assurance that the AP was checking for accuracy. But with a new paradigm, with cable news networks would report something that someone else reported, and if later they learned it wasn't accurate, well, they just reported again, not so much as a correction, but as if it was news that it was not accurate when it was first reported. Well, this created a new awareness among news consumers. A friend of mine told me a number of years ago that if he saw something on television that was news, he'd wait about 3 days to see if he could determine if it was really true. Then along came the internet in the 1990s. Desperate for content to sell digital advertising, companies like Yahoo and Google bought news content from the Associated Press, which incidentally is owned by most of the daily newspapers in America. These new companies would take the AP News report and they would mix it with news from other sources, some of which did not have the same journalistic rigor or accuracy as the AP. So you had both accurate and maybe inaccurate information merged together in a scrolling website. Well, this created obvious credibility problems. Then along came another company called Facebook, and they created terms like news feeds, which might actually include some news, but also just personal content too. These news feeds started including information that was anonymous. This crossed another boundary. For example, our and most newspapers will not publish any letters to the editor that are anonymous. Contrast that with all the anonymous or unrecognizable names you see on Facebook. You see, with anonymity, people will say things they wouldn't say in person, or if their identities were disclosed. So it's easy to see how this all devolved into a lot more vitriol than you would read in a family newspaper. The format also played a role in the decline of credibility. As newspapers almost universally gave away their news for free, and they did it mostly on scrolling websites, they were delivering their news in the exact same format as many less reputable websites, or even websites spreading disinformation or misinformation. The format was the same for both. The scrolling website. These websites would, without normal journalistic standards, tended to tarnish the news organizations that had good standards, which further eroded public confidence. According to journalism professor Iris Shai at the University of Texas, who is a leading scholar on the study of digital subscriptions, this blurring of the lines between accurate and inaccurate news websites made the scrolling website appear to be an inferior product. It's more difficult for newspapers to charge for their news online than what they could charge for a printed newspaper. You see, a printed newspaper conveys the idea of a professionally curated news product. These subscriber value perceptions are part of the reasons for the decline in local newspaper economics. The New York Times publisher, A.G. Sulzberger, had commented not long ago on his company's goal to reach 15 million digital subscribers by 2027, 5 years from now. Currently, they're closer to 10 million, so they need another 5 million. It appears they have probably realized the low-hanging fruit of digital subscribers, and the next 5 million could be a challenge. So to address that challenge, he said the Times needed greater trust and credibility with readers who believe news needs to be fair and impartial. Now, it's interesting to compare that to 120 years ago, when his great-great-grandfather, Adolph Ox, came up from the Chattanooga Times and gained ownership control of the New York Times. In the 1890s, many of the big New York dailies were cutting the single copy price to a penny a copy. It even has a name in journalism history. It's called the penny press. Also at that time, most of the newspapers in America were highly partisan, often affiliated with one political party or the other. Well, Adolph Ox realized that his New York competitors were cutting the price to a penny to get more circulation, which would yield more advertising revenue. So even if it was a loss leader to go to a penny a copy, it would be more profitable for the paper overall. Ox was an astute businessman and publisher, so he came up with an even better idea. He reasoned that if the New York Times was not affiliated with either political party and instead stressed impartiality in news coverage, he could get even more circulation. And you know what? His strategy worked, and it did not go unnoticed. Soon, more and more newspapers were moving away from partisan news to impartial coverage. Soon, impartiality and objectivity in news coverage became the standard in America. And that prevailed for most of the 20th century. Quite a contrast to the 19th century in American journalism. Adolph Ox coined a phrase, to me, one of the greatest in American journalism, and he did it in under 10 words. And those 10 words were, quote, to give the news impartially without fear or favor, end quote. So the New York Times actually could come full circle over a century later, like Ox did in the 1890s, to again emphasize impartiality in news, with the same business reasons today as then, to increase readership and paid subscriptions. So what is the solution? How can trust be restored in the American news media? Well, I believe Adolph Ox's famous phrase is as relevant today as it was 120 years ago. And to me, it's a key to the solution. The New York Times has great science reporting, and they have great arts coverage. But most of the people I know, whether they're liberal or conservative, do not believe the political, election, and national public affairs reporting in the Times is as impartial. Hopefully, A.G. Sulzberger will go back to his great-great-grandfather's phrase over a century ago. If he does, I think the Times may get to that 15 million. And in doing so, not only benefit them, but provide a great journalistic service with renewed impartial standards for American news media. So I want to tell you now about a trip I made 5 years ago. My wife and I were on a bike trip in Vietnam with some other friends. And so I was looking for some US news. So I turned to CNN International. And there was Christiane Amanpour, who I certainly respected for doing great reporting out of the Middle East. And in fact, she's doing some very good reporting right now out of Ukraine. But she was doing an ad for her employer, CNN. And as I was buttoning my shirt, getting ready to go down to dinner, she said, I don't believe in the false equivalency of giving both sides. I stopped buttoning my shirt. I thought to myself, did I hear that correctly? I remember that's the first thing I learned in Journalism 101 in college. You always give both sides. She then said, it's my job to determine the truth and then reveal that to the viewers. Well, the pursuit of truth is indeed a noble goal of journalism, but I've learned that truth is sometimes elusive, deceptive, and it reveals itself sometime, not immediately, but after a period of time. So I believe that until the truth is completely verified, it's better to give readers facts. So I realized I did not want our readers to think what she said were our journalistic values. But how was I going to do that? So I thought, well, the way to do that is tell our readers what our journalistic values are. So I sat down and I drafted 7 short paragraphs, something you could read easily in a minute or two. And I showed them to our other editors. I showed them to the dean of the journalism school at UNC, where I got my journalism degree over 50 years ago. I showed them to some other newspaper owners. One highly respected newspaper owner wrote back, I wouldn't change a single word, They should be on the desk of every CEO of every news organization in America. So in January 2017, 5 years ago, we began publishing this statement of core values on page 2 in all 10 of our daily newspapers every single day. And as you see on the screen, this is an example of what we publish every day. Well, it didn't take long to start hearing from our readers. They universally praised them. I got comments like, quote, "Finally, someone is willing to adopt solid journalistic standards," end quote. And another quote was, quote, "Now we know how to hold you accountable," end quote. And I thought, exactly. I realized quickly that these core values were very popular with our readers. So within a year or so, the dean and the University of North Carolina approached us about naming the journalism school there for our family. Well, I was first taken aback, given that names like Cronkite adorn certain journalism schools. And we first turned it down and said, you know, it just, I don't think we can do it. But when we finally did figure out a way to financially do it, we made 2 requests. The first request was that they reverse the name of the school. The school was called the School of Media and Journalism. And we asked them to name it the School of Journalism and Media. In other words, journalism first. The other condition was that they would embrace and adopt the statement of core values with some slight modifications for the school. And the school and the university agreed to do both. So some probably thought we made this donation for some reasons, like the fact that I was an alumnus and a number of my family members had graduated from UNC, but that was not the main reason. Some may have assumed we wanted our name on the school. Well, they approached us first, and I did think it was an honor to recognize 4 generations of our family committed to journalism, but that was not the main reason. Some might have thought it was because our family loves journalism, and we do. And giving journalism to one of the best journalism schools in the country could be a great way to support journalism, but that was not the main reason. So what was the main reason? It was the idea that if we could get one of the top journalism schools in America to embrace these core values, maybe we could get other journalism schools to do likewise. And maybe we could get other news organizations to do it too. And we could slowly start gaining credibility and trust, regaining our credibility and trust with the public. Now, maybe I'm naive, and maybe there's a better way of restoring the public's trust. And if there is, I'd love to hear about it. So let me briefly show you each of these core values. And of course, we start with Adolph Ochs' famous quote about impartiality. And then we define impartiality. And it means reporting, editing, and delivering the news honestly, fairly, objectively, and without personal opinion or bias. We then note that credibility is the greatest source of a greatest asset of a news organization, and impartiality is the greatest source of credibility. We also note that to provide the most complete report, a news organization must not just follow the news, not just cover the news, but uncover it. It must follow the story wherever it leads, regardless of any preconceived idea of what might be most newsworthy. Now, the pursuit of truth is a noble goal of journalism, but the truth is not always apparent or known immediately. The journalist's role is therefore not to determine what they believe at the time to be the truth and reveal only that to their readers or viewers or listeners, but rather to report as completely and as impartially as possible all verifiable facts, so the readers can, based on their own knowledge and experience, determine what they believe to be the truth. And then importantly, when a newspaper or any news organization delivers both news and opinions, the impartiality and the credibility of the news organization can be questioned. So to minimize this as much as possible, there needs to be a sharp and clear distinction between news and opinion, both to those providing the news and to those consuming the news. And lastly, something my father said often and was very helpful, certainly in my career, was that our newspaper had 5 constituencies, including first its readers, then its advertisers, then its employees, then its creditors, and then its shareholders. And as long as the newspaper keeps those constituencies in that exact order, especially its readers first, all the constituencies will be well served. Now note in these core values, I've used the word objectivity. That word has come under attack in certain journalism circles. People say, well, no one can be objective. So does that mean you shouldn't even try to be objective? To me, it's like saying, well, no one's completely virtuous. So does that mean we shouldn't try to be virtuous? I looked up the definition of objective in the dictionary, and here's what I found. It's not influenced by personal feelings, interpretations, or prejudice, based on facts, unbiased. Doesn't that sound like a laudable goal in reporting news? Don't you think the public would have more confidence in news reporting with that? Which brings up another consideration. Objectivity is not just some state of mind or an object of reality. It's a guideline and a goal to pursue in reporting a news story, its details and its context. I was recently reading about Albert Einstein, who in 1919 believed in the solid state theory of the universe. Now, this theory was that the universe was static. It always had been, and it always would be. Then 12 years later, in 1929, he changed his mind. Based on new evidence, he realized he had been wrong. And now he believed the universe was constantly expanding, and it probably had been for billions of years. I'm thinking that Albert Einstein was being objective. He was willing to change his mind upon seeing new evidence. Isn't that a good standard for journalists too? To keep an open mind rather than adhering to a narrative that may or may not prove true in the future. I was reading in the papers recently and I found the word objectivity recently in a few news stories. On a story about Ukraine and our intelligence gathering there before and after the war, Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, said this, quote, "Objectivity is a core ethic of intelligence." I was reading a news obituary about a former US Senator, Kanister Hodges. And in September of 1978, he led the Senate in a prayer. And his prayer was, quote, "Heal our wounded feelings, release our tensions, restore our objectivity." Well, this raises the question is, what is the underlying objection, especially among some journalists, to be or try to be objective? You know, it may just be human nature. Think about it. Don't we all want people to agree with us? Don't we all want other people to think like we do? I think that's kind of part of the human condition. But that's why these core values are so necessary. Think of them as guardrails for journalists doing news reporting. Of course, it would seem tempting to write a news story to convince others to our way of thinking. But that's the very reason reporters need to resist these normal human instincts in order to tell the story as straight as possible, to keep our emotions, our prejudices, and our politics out of covering the news. These core values of journalism help us do just that. My hope is that more journalism schools and more news organizations will embrace these time-tested principles of journalism so we can begin to regain the trust of the American people. Well, I'd be happy to answer any questions or receive any comments, and I thank you for the opportunity to visit with you tonight.
Walter, well, thank you for giving us so much food for thought here. And I know several students in the room who are from some of your coverage areas in Tennessee and Arkansas. So I hope wherever they're from, they've got some questions. I see some questions coming in online. My colleague Clemente Lisi is going to be monitoring those. So please, if you're online watching this webinar, use the Q&A function right there in Zoom, and we'll ask your questions over time here. And if you're in the room, you'll have an opportunity to ask questions as well. I think as a journalism professor prerogative here, I'm gonna have my colleague Clemente ask the first question, then I'll ask one while people are thinking of their questions, and then we'll go right to the audience. So Clemente.
Thanks. Walter, thanks for being here virtually for a great talk. My question is, what newspapers do you read every day? Which ones, in your opinion, do you think strive to be objective in the news report?
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble understanding that over this Zoom call. Can you repeat that?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Is that better?
Should we have Clemente come up here, or no? Okay. Is that better, Walter? Can you hear his question
now? Is it better?
Yeah, or you can repeat the question from if someone's there near the microphone.
Yeah. So the question is, which newspapers do you read every day, and which ones do you think are doing a good job of being objective?
I'm sorry, it's still difficult.
I'll repeat it. I'll repeat it from here, Walter.
Sure.
Clemente is asking, which newspapers do you read every day, and which ones do you find to be most objective? Did I capture that, Clemente?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I get to ask the question about objective a lot, but I read our Democrat-Gazette every day, and that's our paper here in Little Rock. I read, from time, I kind of skim some of our other newspapers, or might read them if they've got some kind of major story in it. I try to read I subscribe to the Wall Street Journal and also the New York Times. I read those not every day, but as often as possible. I read a lot of other things like The Economist magazine and things like that. So which news organizations or newspapers do I find to be the most objective? Or people will also ask me, where do I go to really find just straight news? And, it's a tough question to answer. And what I normally say is it depends on what type of coverage you're looking for. As I mentioned, I think the New York Times has excellent coverage of science and the arts. So, you're interested in that. I think the Wall Street Journal, I think, is fairly objective. I saw a group in Colorado created called the Media Bias Chart. And the very most objective, most accurate source of news they had happens to be that column in the Wall Street Journal that's called What's News. And literally it just gives you it just gives it to you, a paragraph at a time, and just pretty much straight news, both world news, U.S. news, and business news. I personally listen to a 5-minute podcast every morning from Fox News and also from NPR. I don't think in 5 minutes either one is. They're just giving you what's happened around the world. They're not trying to spin or slant it one way or the other. So it's an increasing challenge, and it's hard to find newspapers that they're as objective as they used to be.
Great, thank you. I wanted to ask you a question, Walter, which is your opening thesis proposed there's two types of journalism, news and opinion. And I'm curious what you say about non-daily news reporting for categories such as enterprise. We call it enterprise or feature reporting. Sometimes you see things like narrative nonfiction. or investigative reporting. You mentioned arts coverage. We see profile writing. And so that's different than hard news. And I'm wondering, how do you see someone, a journalist or publication, maintaining objectivity in some of these genres of journalism that might require a working thesis or point of view that some might see as opinionated?
Right. Well, the way we do it is we label everything, whether if it's opinion. If it's opinion, we label it. For example, our sports columnist, we label it opinion. Our outdoor writer, we label it opinion. Every column in our newspaper, on the, on our op-ed page, or, even on our editorial page, there's a column, we label it as opinion. So I think the key is to labeling things that are opinion and not opinion. I think that's a good way to do it. Now, investigative reporting, I think, is a little different now. Someone was telling me not long ago, well, look, all investigative reporting is opinion. And I said, well, no, not really. I said, once you do investigative reporting, you don't start out and say, we're going to go out and prove this. You go in and investigate, and you may find something different than what you originally thought it was going to be. And that's happened to us numerous times. We came out, sort of had a thesis about why we were going to investigate something. And once we dug into it, it was different than what we thought. So investigative reporting, I say the main word there is investigative. And as you gather more and more facts, you're not sure exactly where the story is going to take you.
Excellent, thank you. We've got, why don't we take an online question while we're dealing with a small technical difficulty. Clemente, do you want to try to read it? If not, I'll reread it from here.
Yeah, I'll try to read it. Walter, can you hear me? I don't think you can, Paul.
Okay. Let me go ahead and read. This is a question from Gary Fong, who's a noted photojournalist in the San Francisco Bay Area. Hi, Gary. Hope you're doing well. And Gary asks this. Do you have an ideal what the Russian and Chinese people think of state-sponsored media? An idea, I think, what the Russian and Chinese people think of state-sponsored media in their respective countries. Do they trust their own media?
Yeah, that's it's just so disheartening to see how reports that a lot of the people in those countries take at face value what the government tells them. I guess they just don't have that tradition of the fourth estate really being a check and balance against the rest of the government. And, I do think that that even in Russia today, where they really try to tightly control the narrative, there are people who are finding out the truth of what's going on in Ukraine and the rest of the world. And, but it's not easy. And maybe the more significant problem is if they do find out the real truth of what's happening, then they're totally intimidated from speaking out because of such harsh penalties. There are literally reporters in Russia who have died trying to report news. So it's very disheartening to see that. But and then it's also disheartening to see people just take what the government tells them at face value.
Thank you so much. Are there questions in the room? I could have someone come right up here and ask your question, and then Walter could see you because of the camera we have here. Yeah, come on up, Joe. Yeah. Feel free to introduce yourself too.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Walter. My name is Joe Agostino. I work at NBC actually in research for about 10 years now. And first of all, thank you for everything you're saying. This is music to my ears in ways I can't even begin to describe because I've been beating this drum a really long time, especially to a lot of my colleagues who give me a lot of blank stares and don't seem to agree with that. So it's really refreshing to hear this. I have two quick questions. If you've heard of apps like All Sides Now, where they basically just serve as an aggregator and they bring together like the left-leaning talking point, the right-leaning talking point, the center-leaning talking point, and then they'll actually have that all point back to like the same headline. And if there's any hope there in maybe some kind of algorithm-based future of news where everyone is just getting, everything's opinionated as it exists, but they're at least getting all sides of the opinion on the same headline, And then secondly, what's your take on like measurement services like Nielsen and ComScore, where maybe that's like a little bit of a tilted scale to begin with and potentially causing issues with, trust as well?
Yeah, second part of the question, was that Nielsen, did you mention, or is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm really very well informed to answer the second part of that question, but I think a site that pulls together both columns from the right and the left, it provides a real service. This group, Ad Fortes, I think is the name of it in Colorado, that has this media bias chart. And when we looked at our newspaper, the Democrat-Gazette in Little Rock, we were up very close to the top. But more importantly, the top was for very accurate and objective and fair news. The very bottom was for misinformation, disinformation. But then they had the axis from right to left. And so on the right was, of course, more conservative, and left was more liberal. And right in the middle, there was a line, which would be, and there were only about 3 news organizations on that line, and one of them was ours. And I started thinking, well, it's a tribute to the fact that we really bend over backwards to try to be fair, objective, and impartial in our coverage. But then I started thinking, probably another reason they graded us that way is because we carry both liberal and conservative columnists, not just national columnists. We have local columnists that are both liberal and conservative. And so I think we really do believe in the free marketplace of ideas and presenting all sides. And when you do that, I think it enhances the newspaper's reputation for fairness and presenting all sides. So I think to the extent people have access to contrasting points of view, it's a real plus.
Great, thanks, great question. I'm going to read one online from McKenna McCoy, who asks, how do you test whether a news article is objective, particularly political pieces? Also, do you think facts are ever up for debate? When are facts? I guess she's got 3 questions here. I don't know if you want to take both of those and then a third.
Yeah, so the first one was, how do you determine if a news story is objective? Well, it's kind of like pornography. When you know it when you see it, I guess. We get these all the time, especially from our wire services, and we can see the way the wording is phrased, that people have already, the writer's already reached a conclusion. And I see a lot of examples where they say so-and-so falsely claimed. Maybe so. Some cases, maybe not. Why not just put what someone claims? And then if you think it's false, then provide some other third-party information to make the reader try to decide, do they really believe it's false or not? So we really run into this more on the national wire services than we do on local reporting. And I was just stopped today by the State Department of Education, and he was commenting that we had 2 reporters that were covering him and what was going on in a town, Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He said, I really appreciate how fair and even-handed you all have been in your reporting. So anyway, that's why we have wire editors. That's why we have editors, to try to pull out any kind of bias or what we determine is not being fair and objective. So that was the first part of the question. What was the second?
Yeah. The second layer she asked is sort of 2 parts, but it's about facts. And she asked, do you think facts are ever up for debate? And when are they disputable and when are they indisputable? And she thanks you for your remarks. Oh,
right. Yeah, facts. Well, facts, that's interesting. First of all, let's talk about truth, and then we'll get to facts. I'm one of the ones that believe there is an absolute truth. There's not a relative truth. Everyone doesn't have their own truth. There is a truth. And facts are kind of the same way. Arkansas was brought into the United States in 1836. That's just a fact, And so some people may claim something as a fact, and it's not necessarily a fact. So you have to go back and verify it. You know, yes, I think true facts, you know, you can get to the truth of whether or not it is really true or not. And that's part of our job to do that.
Excellent, thanks. I know we've got a question in the room. Why don't you come on up here so Walter can see you? I think Joshua's from Texas.
I don't know if you can tell. So it's pretty, I'm sorry.
I was born 2 miles from Texas in Texarkana, so we like Texas.
So you're probably familiar with the road difference then on the border. Was it still the same? No, never mind. I'm sorry, I made this jacket. So it's pretty common these days for news organizations, even the bigger ones, to have like snippets of their stories on social media, like a gripping headline, then a link to that story, and maybe like a little bit of information. But usually, a lot of people don't click the link; they just see the snippet on social media, and that's all they know about the story. So I'm wondering, is it possible to be fair or not to be like completely fair and thoroughly objective in those little snippets? Or is that really like short snippety style of like clickbaity journalism fundamentally opposed to good journalism?
You know, it's much more difficult to be fair and completely objective with snippets of news than it is longer articles. You really need the context. You really need the details. You know, at one point we hung up a big banner in our newsroom that said, "Details make the difference." So we need to give our readers details, and you can't do that you can't do that satisfactorily with a headline or a snippet of news.
Great.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions in the room before I ask Prof. Lisi to ask another one? Yeah, come on. I've seen a couple of hands up. So could you come on up here? I think it's fun for Walter to be able to see some of the audience, even though we're in distant locations. So Miriam and Stephen can come up here. Miriam is a student, journalism student here from Baltimore, as I recall.
Yes. Hi, my name is Mary Garcia. I'm a junior at King's College and campus editor for EST and intern for AM New York. So my question has something to do with things that could possibly affect a reporter's ability to be objective, specifically regarding like interviewing certain people. So I've talked to a lot of investigative journalists and they deal with a lot of traumatized people. And one thing that the people I've talked to was it's important for a reporter to show empathy and sympathy for these people. But I feel like in a sense that could probably affect their ability to be objective. So do you think reporters should be empathetic or more professional when talking to specifically traumatized people?
Yeah, I've been interviewed by reporters many times, and I think empathy is a good thing. It helps you gain the trust of the person you're interviewing. And just like a good doctor that's empathetic, you tend to have more trust with a doctor like that than you do than one that's in a hurry and, you know, brusque, et cetera. So yeah, I think that helps. I think it helps you as a reporter get a better view of the whole story and get a better interview and get more news. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Thanks. Yeah, and now we have Stephen Kirksey, who's an author and a journalist based in New York here.
Yeah, I also teach the class Media Law and Ethics. And Mr. Hussman, you came to my class a couple of years ago. So we got to speak with you in person when you visited the school, and that was great. I feel like somebody has to ask a question about your very public back and forth with Hannah Nicole Jones and the 1619 Project. The implication from all that, when I was reading it from at home in the news, was that you stood for one form of journalism and that Hannah Nicole Jones stood for another form of journalism. You know, one was more into what you talked about, focused on the objectivity, and Hannah Jones of the New York Times, whose piece won a Pulitzer Prize, was why they recognized it being a great piece, was not so focused on objectivity. Was that a fair understanding? Was that a fair portrayal of it in the media? And is it so clear, is it so black and white as it's you on one side and her on the other? Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to meet Nicole Hannah Jones and talk to her about actually these core values and what she thought about them. I was really welcoming the opportunity to do that. I wasn't really sure exactly what she would say, you know. And I also wanted to talk to her because I wanted to tell her there's certain things I really admired about her. First of all, she's very passionate about what she believes, and I like passionate people, okay? And she's really trying to drive home the reality of how terrible we had a situation in the country for many, many decades in the way we treated minorities, especially in the South. And I completely agree with that, you know, and to make the public more aware of that is probably a good thing. I think the more we know about our history, the better we are. And I think the fact that when you read this history, you realize how far we have come and how much progress we've made. I just, you know, I just didn't believe that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery. Still don't believe that. And so that was my concern, you know. And yeah, no, it wasn't so much a question of different approaches to journalism. Maybe we do have very different approaches to journalism. And but I didn't know that at the time the controversy was going on.
Great, thank you for that. Was a important question and exchange as well. I want to ask, we've got time for a couple more questions. So I know Clemente has at least one more, and I have one more. And let me know if there's any other sort of burning last question in the room. Per Anders, come on up. Per Anders is from Sweden originally, and does journalism, video, storytelling, and other things here in New York.
Hey, great hearing your crash course in journalism. Reminder of all the basic good stuff. I don't know if I'm taking the scope too broad, but being from another part of the world, I often run into in discussions with friends or even talking on you know, more academically about these things. When you're in America, it's always, you know, it's a certain environment where it's left and right, and that's it. You know, you're either this or that. But if you look at Sweden, for me, it can be hard to, you're looking at a whole country. I mean, if you want to take it to the extreme, you look at Russia, right, who thinks objectivity is inherently bad in itself. How do we deal with this idea or the fact that an entire population is, you know, inherently biased, and news there's another way of being unobjective, that is silencing news. You only lift up what you want to be heard, and the other things you kind of ignore. I guess that's a human thing too that we wrestle with. Do you have any input on that? I don't even know if that's a question, but it's something I wrestle with. Like, how do you deal with the idea that you may be talking to an entire population that has a completely different slant? Let's say left or right, like Sweden, for instance, or Scandinavia has a very left-leaning slant, but they would never show any of these bad clips of Biden, but they would only show bad clips of, so it's almost like the left media, but the whole country is like that, right?
All right. Well, I think this gets back to truth. I think there's truth in journalism. I think there's truth in religion. I believe if you have a passion for telling the truth, even if it's not a popular opinion among the people you're talking to, you need to express that. I mean, this happened in the United States during the Jim Crow era, when the popular opinion was very much against providing greater civil rights for all Americans, especially minorities. And you had many courageous journalists, many in the South, who spoke up for what they thought was morally correct. And a lot of them, they had a lot of threats against them for doing that. So yeah, I think whether you're in Russia or you're in Jim Crow South or you're in Sweden or wherever, whether you're a journalist or not, you need to speak up for what you believe is morally and ethically right and truthful.
Great. Another question from a student named Abby from Pennsylvania.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to talk to us tonight. I wanted to kind of add on the question of social media a little bit. I'm in Gen Z, and I think I can speak for my entire generation that we have a short attention span. So how would do you have practical tools on how to remain objective in really short 140 character tweets or short videos, just in the social media age, how we can still remain objective with a short attention span where we don't want to read many, details or paragraphs of values or anything like that.
Right. Well, that with Twitter at 140 characters, the thing I get the most out of Twitter when I look at it is that when it provides a link to something more lengthy, so they can give me a snippet of information, but if it leads me to more documented and more thoroughly, researched and information, then I think that's the most helpful way to do it. So, but it's very difficult to get across the whole picture with 140 characters.
Thank you.
So I'm enjoying, I think typical King's fashion, how people are really taking serious the thesis and the content and wrestling with it and seeking clarification. So I wanted to I had one quick question around, you're talking about getting two sides of the story or both sides. And I've noticed a lot of people in our industry really even coining a term, both sidism, and saying we need to throw that out. People struggling, using that as sort of a term that's not favorable anymore, and also objectivity as you addressed. But on this issue of both sidism, I wondered if people are getting too hung up on two sides. And I try to teach my students that there's rarely even two sides. And instead of saying there's only one side and we don't need to see the other side, we actually need many sides. And I just wanted to throw that out there and see if you wanted to clarify or elaborate more on that kind of issue as well, because it's this, it's like this cudgel in our own industry where people are beating each other up with, I think, sometimes.
Right. Yeah, so I believe that many stories do have more than two sides. They have multiple sides and multiple aspects. And so I agree with that. This idea that both sidesism kind of implies that our side's right and the other side's wrong. And so, well, that's a little bit arrogant and takes a little bit of hubris to assert that. And so I always think, if they think that, do they want that same standard applied to somebody that doesn't agree with them, that would say, well, we don't agree with both sidesism either because we're right and you're wrong? Well, if you're going to do that, you need to get into opinion writing, in my opinion. And, I think you just, we need to know the who, what, when, where, how, and why. And we've got thousands of places we can go get opinions, but we have a shrinking number of people that are really telling us exactly the facts of what happened. And we need people that'll do that. So we don't need people making, I think, decisions on, well, there's only really one side to this.
Thank you for elaborating on that. I see, why don't we take two more so I've got Mindy here, and Mindy, why don't you come on up and ask your question?
Thank you, Mr. Hussman. My question is, since you are an owner and publisher of a newspaper that has shown to be pretty objective based on the information that you showed, what is the business model that you as a owner have employed to keep your newspaper successful alongside the other business models you described of like heavy opinion journalism because it's less expensive to produce?
Yeah. Well, there's a real debate about that in America today. A lot of people think, the successful business model is just be more opinionated. And certainly places like MSNBC and Fox News and people have kind of, have looked at that and said, see, that's the successful business model. or even the New York Times, when they're less than objective, people say, well, let's see how successful they are with their digital subscribers. So I still feel there's a real opportunity for any news organization to provide people with straight information. CNN was extremely successful for many years doing that. Most news organizations were very successful doing that in the 20th century. I think they can do it in the 21st century also. And, you know, for example, if one of the major cable networks right now just said, we're going to do away with opinion shows. We're going to just report straight news 24 hours, 7 days a week and be as objective as possible. There's a good thought that they could be very successful with that. Maybe no one's courageous enough to do that, and maybe no one can feel like they could get the talent to do that. But I think it's been successful for us with our newspapers. I think greater credibility means your subscribers renew more often than they would otherwise. I hear a lot of people in Little Rock or Chattanooga or the towns say, you know, we go to other communities and our newspaper is so much better than these other towns, some of them larger. So I think it's a winning strategy, even if it isn't a real popular strategy among owners today.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we've gone on a bit. I see some more hands, but I did promise my colleague, Prof. Lisi, to get the last question. So Clemente, you want to come up and ask your last question? And I guess we'll just have to do something like this again in New York so more people can keep talking and asking questions.
Hi, Walter, how are you? My question is, do you think that the objectivity came under fire because it was exacerbated by the Trump administration in the arguments with reporters, where the Trump administration basically saw the press as the adversary party? Do you think that that inflamed things?
Yeah, I think that it was already trending that way before Trump came on the scene. And I think it got worse, you know, because, you know, I think too many people in the news media thought, well, the end justifies the means. This guy's really bad news. We got to get rid of it. So, you know, we got to do it even if maybe if it compromises our standards of journalism. I mean, that's I understand where they're coming from, but the end justifying the means usually is not a good idea. So, but I do think it made matters worse.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all the people here who attended as well and asked questions and wrestled with the concepts, and especially Walter for being here to walk us through what he's been working on here and in recent years, things that are important to him. And I think there's a lot of hope, and there's a lot of hope in the future of young people in this room who want to go into journalism. So let's thank Walter one more time. Walter.
I'd like to just say one other thing to the young people there. I was asked this question at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, by a journalism student. They said, you know, if the news organizations are undergoing such financial difficulties, why would I want to have a career in journalism? And my answer to that is the demand for news is not going down. It's the same and maybe increasing compared to what it's been in the past. So there's always going to be a demand for people to want to know, tell me what's happening so I can make more sense out of my world. And if you go into journalism, you're going to be better trained to do your job professionally and with standards and principles and values than a lot of people who are trying to fill that vacuum right now. So I don't know what the newspaper business or the television business or any of these businesses will look like, but there's always going to be a demand for somebody with your talents and your expertise.
Wonderful. Well, that's a great note to end on. So thank you once again.